what I do in my work is really try to normalize the fact that like every one of us fails. Nobody's perfect. Nobody does something the first time and is like, oh, that was a masterpiece. So much is about unlearning generational trauma patterns, unlearning messages people have said about us, whether it's parents or society or school teachers or whatever, unlearning those things and realizing, wait, like this is my true authentic self. And I need to clear all of the noise so that I can get to that. That perfectionist is so tied to, I have to prove myself. We have to unlearn that and say, no, you are good enough. The messaging that you're not is something that is not, it's not factual.
It is possible, once you know that this is what it is possible to retell that story, rewire your mind to perceive in different ways.
Hello everyone, I am Obro and this is Stories and Stanza. Let's dive into what makes us human through intimate conversations about creativity, failure, and resilience. Let's begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Stories and Stanza. And today I have Patty with me as our guest, and she's a psychologist from Chicago. And Patty, welcome to Stories and Stanza. We have been exchanging ideas for some time, and I really wanted to have you as a guest on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. I'm wonderful. I'm excited to speak with you. And yeah, we've had like really great discourse over social media. So excited to talk more about some of the threads we've been exchanging and like thoughts about lots of things. So thank you so much for having me.
I really like Threads as a platform because
Mhm.
I think I have met some of my wonderful guests on Threads, and I think that it follows the same sort of format as Twitter, but I think Twitter has gotten like it has changed a lot over time, and there are too many hashtags and too many wrong sort of updates and things. I don't really like that as a platform as opposed to Threads, where I think how they have handled that situation better is using one sort of content tag for your posts, and that sort of brings you closer to people who are on social media on similar subjects. Like if you want to interact with poets, if you want to interact with writers and psychologists and so forth. So it does that grouping as per your thinking. So it brings you closer to people that you really believe in, yeah, yourself. So I'm thankful to Threads for connecting me with some of my guests. For our listeners today, so we intend to cover some interesting aspects related to the psychology of migration. And we have had some interesting sort of talking points. So before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how this theme speaks to you, why this is so important to you?
So it comes from a very personal place and just I was born in Chicago shortly after my parents migrated. And so just watching all of the different dynamics that we were growing up with, and my mom was only 18 when she had me, and so she was really growing up and developing her culture outside of like not outside of but like alongside of Indian culture and bringing that here and also acclimating to American culture or trying to at least. And so really that's the story for both of my parents. And while I was born here through a lot of cultural aspects of America that I just naturally picked up on because of friendships, because of school, just my environment. And so immigration for me and looking at like what the experience has been for my parents versus me, and even together intergenerationally, how we have similarities and then some really fundamental differences that have caused some heartache between us as well. So good, bad, ugly related to immigration.
That is wonderful. And I am an immigrant myself. I lived in many places in India before I moved outside. And then ever since I've been outside India, I have always questioned this, like, where does my identity lie? How, do I mix with where I am going, or do I keep my identity as I know it? And that has led to a lifetime of explorations, and we will talk about that through the conversation. But before we get started, there's something that I really like to hear from my guests, and that's because I call this section of the podcast as Fail With Me. And there are a couple of reasons. So I see a lot of times in our society, we just talk about success or success in more materialistic terms, and we don't talk often about failure. And when we are going through failure in our lives, then it becomes harder and harder for us to accept, understand, and move to the next step. So I had a few difficult years, and I thought that if I start opening up about failures, or if I start looking at failures more objectively and try to understand what that tells us, then it would be a good thing. And that's what I've been doing in this podcast. It has been enriched by voices from people around the world. And I think that when we started talking on social media, I think one of the key points, if I just have to kind of generalize what we really connected upon, is about unlearning our conditioning. And
Yeah.
we talked about it in different aspects, but essentially we talked about unlearning, and that's one of the key pillars that I try to cover in Fail With Me. And also it gives you that compassion towards yourself, that you failed, so what, you try something else. So as opposed to tagging yourself as failure, you just understand failure as one state and then you move on to the next. So that's basically the theme behind Fail With Me. And as a psychologist, yeah, can you tell us, how does this speak to you? Does it resonate with you? Does it connect with the work that you are doing and so forth?
Mm. Yeah, no, I love that title, Fail With Me, because so much to say about what a beautiful title it is, but failure is often experienced in isolation. It's like, oh, I messed up. Like, why did I do that? And like, I'm awful, or all these like negative messages that we tell ourselves, all this negative self-talk that goes on, bounces around our heads. And really, like, when we fail, we don't, if we look at social media, people aren't bragging about their failures. They're bragging about all of the good and amazing things and all the trips and like all the good things. And so I think Fail With Me is so deep rooted. I think just hearing the title, I'm like, oh, it's just so rooted in community rather than isolation. And so yes, that theme resonates strongly. And what I do in my work is really try to normalize the fact that like every one of us fails. Nobody's perfect. Nobody does something the first time and is like, oh, that was a masterpiece. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I edited my memoir or a piece of poetry that might be like 5 lines. And I'm like, oh, I gotta go back. I gotta go. It's like whatever it is, it's like even in writing, in life, all of it, it's like doing things again until we learn, until we unlearn and unlearn again, as you were talking about, which I strongly agree with. So much is about unlearning generational trauma patterns, unlearning messages people have said about us, whether it's parents or society or school teachers or whatever, unlearning those things and realizing, wait, like this is my true authentic self. And I need to clear all of the noise so that I can get to that. So in my mind, failure is really more often exploration. So I think when you say fail with me, my first understanding is like, oh, explore, explore with me so we can get to where we want to go. And so it's a very gentle, very kind, loving, community-based title. I just really love it. So Yeah.
Thank you so much. And this is something we should try to talk and explore in our session today. So, of course, the migration and then the generational trauma, and then also understanding uh, like so the trauma is one part, but understanding oneself when we are affected by trauma is something a little bit more significant. And we also talked about like the changing dynamics, like the family dynamics are changing because of migration, and that affects our awareness in many ways. So let us try to get into that. So for our listeners, could you talk us a little bit about your line of work? Where do you predominantly focus on, and some of the barriers that you notice in this space? And then we will try to get into more details.
Sure. So I was a generalist and I narrowed in on really trauma. And then, of course, anxiety and depression that comes with that, and other mental health issues that come up along with trauma. And so I really focused in on trauma, as well as, which is sometimes very closely connected, is obsessive compulsive disorder. And I specialize in that. And those two really, when I start talking about the dynamics of those, I realize they really resonate for people who are immigrants into another country and have that experience of being, of trying to acculturate, but still feeling like the other, and always that feeling of the other, even if they're at home with their parents. Maybe they migrated together, maybe they were born in the new country, whatever it is. There's a sense of like one foot here, another foot somewhere else, maybe a few feet in different places, because we're just such a tapestry of our experiences. And so with migration, especially, there's the nuances of what are we carrying? What are we carrying with us? What have our parents and generations prior carried? And even just with immigrating can be very traumatic for some people, and all of the different factors, the adjustment, the socioeconomic factors, the acceptance or not into a country, like all of those things are something that I often talk about with my patients. And then I've noticed that in immigrant, and this is overgeneralizing, of course, so, everybody is different, I have to say, every family, every immigrant family, I don't even want to overgeneralize about Indian families. There's so many subcultures. So keeping that in mind, I'll say Indian immigrant families, like something that I have seen in other immigrant families as well, but this theme of productivity and performance, like we have to prove ourselves that we are just as good and that we deserve to have this position in life, position at a job, that we deserve to be known as American also. And so I've seen themes of perfectionism, which are often under the umbrella of obsessive compulsive disorder, or at least obsessive tendencies or personality features, where people are trying very hard to live within this very restricted view of what they should be doing. I should get this career. I should be with this type of person. Everything is very scripted, and that causes a lot of emotional distress. So I zone in on that specifically, that like the layers of family trauma, as well as the OCD symptoms that might come up, even if it's not clinically diagnosably OCD, seeing those features of OCD. So.
You touched upon something really fundamental there, which is the perfectionism, and then trying to excel in work or in studies in society. So that is at constant pressure of doing it well. And this is something I realized at a very later stage in my life that I have inherited some of these patterns without knowing that when I was doing it consciously or unconsciously, but that is not me. And that's something I have inherited culturally, maybe. And I guess that is an inherent difference between the eastern and western sort of philosophies work, I guess. So I would like to understand this a little bit more here. Like, to me, this need to excel or to be perfect or to for getting accepted, that comes from some unmet thinking at our core. What has been sort of your observation here?
So often, and I'll stick with talking about this is nuance to, Indian culture, although it shows up in other countries as well. But in Indian culture, there's the idea that we have to align with whiteness. And so that's a theme that often comes up. And we're seeing that so much right now. It's very much in the news in the US where we're having discussions about like who is an immigrant, who perceives themselves as an immigrant versus who doesn't, because some people tend to think like I've been here for 2, 3 generations now, so I'm fully American, I'm not Indian anymore, or even like with other ethnicities, like trying to kind of shake off that idea because there's this alignment with whiteness. And that's something that has been taught generations ago that like if you perform to the standards of whiteness, that is what is right and good. And so that being embedded for generations, people are automatically just trying to conform to those requirements. And so, like a lot of what I've seen is in work environments, for instance, people feel like, oh, I have to perform to this very high standard to make sure that my colleagues see that I'm doing a really good job, that they appreciate what I'm doing. And there's this inner sense of, what's the word? That I'm not good enough in their eyes until I prove that I am. It's this need to prove that, like, yeah, I'm just as smart. I'm just as worthy of having this position that you also have. And so that can create a lot of imposter syndrome where people are like, oh, but am I really qualified to do this? Like, am I really doing as good of a job as my white counterpart? Like, do they see me as part of the team? And in my work and even in my personal experience, I've seen where people, because of racial differences, have perceived, I'll just say for me, for instance, have perceived me as uh, not working as hard. And I had to provide the evidence of that and say, like, oh, but this is the research I've done. This is the work I've done. Whereas some of my white counterparts have not had to prove themselves in that way. And so that can come up in a very obvious way. It can also be in a very insidious way, receiving different opportunities. And I mean, there's so much to say about the systemic ways that equality is not present for different people of different backgrounds, right? But that perfectionist is so tied to, I have to prove myself. And so anytime we're trying to prove ourselves, we're also like, most times we're trying to prove ourselves, we're also overcompensating. And so that's an aspect of that as well, where we're like, oh, I have to work more hours than my colleague. I have to just put in so much more, it comes up in school, it comes up in friendships, which is like embedded in all of these different parts of people's lives. And so we have to undo that. We have to unlearn that and say, no, you are good enough. The messaging that you're not is something that is not, it's not factual. It's actually something that's created by society and societal perceptions. So that's where you see where perfectionism comes in, where obsessiveness comes in, where people start to develop compulsions. They start to become almost addicted to work, thinking that they can prove their value and their worth with how hard they're working. So that's the short answer to that one. It has so many branches to it, but yeah, I think as I'm talking about, it, I'm also remembering like I was working very hard in the research division of an organization, and I had ideas that I presented to my supervisor, who then presented them to the director as though they were her ideas. And I think that is an example I often come back to when we think about the voice of a person of color or even with women, right? Like when we're in a room and it's like, are we really seen? Or do we have to prove ourselves to be seen? So yeah, that's just one example of many.
No, it speaks volume. And I have seen this pattern in so many ways. I can just go on and on about this. And you are so very right that there is that need, that tick in our head, that am I seen? Am I accepted? Am I good enough? And then the behavior that we engage in becomes a kind of a classic overcompensation.
Mhm.
And we will explore the identity side of things in today's conversation. And for our audience, could you tell us a little bit more about OCD and how it sort of affects people? Because then in many cases, like I'm just saying that I'm trying to sort of share facts and explanations around it, because sometimes OCD can is seen that, oh, it's just something in your behavior, it's not harmful. But I have
Mhm.
also seen OCD really impacting your day-to-day life, and if you want, I can talk about it as well. I just wanted to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question because OCD is so very misunderstood. And we often hear people saying, oh, my OCD is acting up, or oh, I'm cleaning because of my OCD. And it's just, there's this mainstream understanding of it that it's this just mild um, form of being rigid or extra clean, not liking germs, but it really goes so far beyond that, where people can develop really really serious obsessions about different things. It can be cleanliness, it can be about health, it could be about performance. It could be that person, for instance, ends up checking their work, schoolwork, their work, their work at a job so many times that it turns into several minutes or even hours. And during that time that they're checking, making sure like, oh, is this email good? Did I make any mistakes? Am I sending it to the right person? Just checking, even just the name of the person that they want to send the email to, for instance, that just really being fixated on that for several minutes or even hours. If we think about like, we might revise an email and that takes an extra like maybe 10, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at most, but people spending hours on that and really picking that apart. And the whole while they're doing that, they're very emotionally distressed, thinking, oh my gosh, what if I make a mistake? What if I do this wrong? What if my boss is upset with me because of it? And that, what if? So it's at its base, it is an anxiety related disorder, but it's then really heightened by these obsessions that really won't allow a person to shift to something else. It starts to affect many areas of daily life. And clearly we can see how it affects work. But then you think about if a person is spending hours checking one email, they're not spending time with their loved ones. If they have children, that's taking away time from their children. It's taking away time from their having to do daily things like their laundry or going to the grocery store, whatever it might be. And so, and that's just one area people have could have obsessions about relationships, relationship OCD, it's called, where they're like, oh, am I supposed to be with this person, this particular person? Am I supposed to be in this particular job? Am I, there are so many categories. There are health-related obsessions, and there are obsessions related to doing things just so, which is very perfectionist related. It's like, oh, this has to be positioned in this way. And if it's not, there's significant distress about it, which if a person doesn't know about it, they can think, oh, that's so frivolous. And it's almost funny and quirky that this person needs this to be, just right. But it's very distressing for the person. There's also harm-related OCD where people might get intrusive thoughts about hurting someone. So they're like, oh, like, what if I accidentally hit someone with my car? What if I accidentally call this person a bad name? What if I stab my loved one? And they have no intention to do it, by the way. That's the difference between a sociopath and a person with OCD, but you can also see why people are very secretive about the disorder, because if they're having these thoughts, they're not going around telling people that they're like, oh my gosh, I'm having thoughts about stabbing my girlfriend, my boyfriend, whatever. So those are just some of them. There are more subtypes, but yes, a very distressing, it can be a very debilitating disorder, and it ranges from mild to severe. And so we can see how when we think about perfectionism and we think about how a person might cope with immigration trauma, for instance, and the desire to fit in, we can understand how a person might, the brain starts to develop almost a way of coping, except it's maladaptive. So it's like, oh, if I just do this very perfectly, then people will accept me. So it can be very related to some trauma that's occurred, but not always, but many times, yes. Many times we're able to track it back to like, oh, this is the place that this might have began. So
Thank you for sharing that. And uh, I wanted to talk about OCD for a little bit because I think it kind of fits into our conversation. And as I was telling you earlier about my family's mental health challenges, and my wife has gone through a period of bipolar and to some extent OCD as well. And it was very hard to diagnose where it was affecting her. And I just wanted to add this to what you already shared, that a lot of times even she didn't know that she was in that obsessive thought process. So the doctors would first categorize everything as depression, but then they'll slowly understand it's not just depression, there are symptoms of bipolar. And when that was understood, then still they realized that she was not completely better. That is when it surfaced that she had some obsessive thoughts in her mind. So they were repeating uncontrollably in one direction. So to speak, like we have rational thoughts and irrational thoughts, but your rational mind would keep your irrational thoughts in control. But sometimes that control is broken, and then irrational thoughts interfere with your rational mind, and then it can go on repeat and making it really hard for the patient. So if anything mental health has taught me, and that is like it is very hard sometimes to articulate what someone is going through, and
Mhm.
then it takes some layers and layers of understanding and studying to get to the bottom of it. So yeah, just thought I'll add it out there. Coming back to where we started from, we were talking about perfectionism and then where that can be rooted. And if we look at perfectionism and then we talk about the main area that we were exploring, the generational trauma, then this is something I love to hear your thoughts on. So some trauma is our own and some trauma can be ancestral. So how does that get transformed into us? How do we inherit those patterns? Are these all behavioral, or there are some genetics behind it as well? One of my guests, who is a life coach and she works with women mostly, and then she told me something beautiful. A lot of times ancestrally, women didn't sort of get the support, like right level of support from their family and their partners, etc., when they were carrying the child, and that led to some negative emotions, and those negative emotions cascaded from them to their children, and when the children were born they were kind of hating their mother, so there were
Mm,
unresolved mother-daughter issues that got passed on from one generation to another. But I'm talking about at a more sort of bigger scale from your observation and from your work. So, what is generational trauma? And trau- our trauma is our own. So, are we passing some of that to others as well? How does that work?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. And again, it has layers. And I think I'd like to start by talking about this amazing book that came out called It Didn't Start With You. You might be familiar with it. The author talks about how trauma is so genetically rooted in our bodies, so much so that we might have an ancestor who, let's say, was an ancestor who had drowned, right? Um, at night, let's say, like I think that was one of his examples. And then generations forward, 2 generations forward, you have somebody who feels like he's suffocating while he's sleeping and comes to find out, like, oh, you had an uncle who drowned in the middle of the night. And now that sounds maybe just like, I don't know, like fiction or whatever it might be. But then he went on to explain how the cells that are created in a woman when she's getting ready to reproduce, right, are carried, those cells are carried through that child and also passed on to the next child. So from grandmother to mother to the child. So genetically, we see that there is a connection. So trauma is very biologically based. And it is also environmentally based. If a person grows up with, let's say, a mother with obsessive compulsive disorder, um, then that child is also learning, like, oh, we have to be very clean at home and we have to behave in these different ways. And it just starts to fold into the child as a part of who she is as well, right? Like she's not thinking like, oh, like I'm doing this because I see my mom do it and maybe even my grandmother do it. I'm doing this because this is what is right. But then she goes around her friends and her friends are like, what are you doing? Like, why are you like folding that thing that way? Why are you like, whatever it might be, why are you checking your answers for several minutes? And the kid is like, oh, well, this is what my mom taught me to do. So it's like children can be taught unhealthy patterns. Children can be taught disorders as well. Unwittingly, of course, like no parent wants their child to inherit something like that, but that is very like it can be very behaviorally and emotionally patterned to the next generation until there's something that intervenes and says like, oh wait, no, that's not healthy. That doesn't feel good or right, and that is taking away my peace. It's taking away my joy to do that. I need to do something differently. So it's nature and nurture is the answer in my experience. And yeah, so it manifests in multiple ways. And I'm
Thank,
sitting here, I'm like, there's so much to say, there's so much more. But yes, please, I'll pause for a moment. What are your thoughts?
no, thank you for that. And this is something me and my brother we often talk about. Like there was a period when I think we were both struggling in our own world. So I moved to Australia and he moved to Europe. So growing up in the same house, and now there are three continents between us. And
Wow,
then
yeah.
we were struggling to find our ground wherever we were. And then it was stressful, and then families and things like that. And then we both of us started journaling, writing
Mhm.
down something we are feeling, and then trying to understand what might have caused this. We're feeling bad about something, what might have caused us.
Mm.
And we were very introspective about it. And then we realized that some of this is not just us, it's coming from our family, coming from more than one generations, which is why we became curious about this and objective about it. Like, oh, if this is it, then we have seen patterns of it, or we have seen traces of our emotional inheritance, let's say, through generations, how we look at it. And then it is possible, once you know that this is what, it is possible to retell that story, rewire
Right.
your mind to perceive in different ways. But it is a lot of work. It's a lot of, I have seen people go through with their life without understanding this, and then in that process they get bitter and upset and frustrated. But there are ways to nurture and change that sort of narrative. Now, we talked about a little bit about the first part of what we had in mind: generational trauma, perfectionism, and this conditioning, etc. And then I think there are some pieces of it is defines who we are, so our self-awareness. And every day I see so many people, be it at work, be it in the family, be it in the friends, etc., that self-awareness is something people struggle with, and they have not started their work on
Mm.
understanding themselves. And this gets particularly difficult in in the scenario that we are talking about, in light of generational trauma, in light of migration, in light of getting accepted, in light of changing a sort of relationship commitments and things like that. We have a changing. Do you want to take a break?
Mm. No, I'm okay. I have my matcha here, so it's nice and warm.
Yes.
Mhm.
So I was saying that there are a lot of areas
Mhm.
that we these factors contribute to ourself, to understanding ourselves. And this is what I wanted to hear from you. And I think we had some interesting discussions about relationships, that how do relationships work in such and such dynamics. But the gender roles have evolved, the society has evolved, and because of these factors, our self awareness is not properly built. But if it is built, then we should be in harmony with whatever changed rules are. So, this is something I want to hear from you in light of what we are discussing, that how do you see self awareness get affected, and what can we do to improve that?
Yes, this is such an important part of trauma, especially generational trauma, and that intersection of trauma and immigration, because so much of it has to do with identity and missed the missed opportunity that many people get, where most of us experience some level of trauma. If we're alive, we've experienced some level of trauma. But when there's generational trauma, generation after generation, these patterns are more and more normalized. And so to see beyond that can be very difficult. That insight that comes from maybe having, like, oh, the opportunity to have other healthy people in the family, like that may not be accessible to an individual. And so their self-awareness is really, it's blocked, and they're just trying to survive from the trauma. Even if they don't know it at the time, like, oh, this is generational trauma, and I'm just trying to survive this unhealthy pattern that's coming from all of the negative messages from my family, maybe the criticism, maybe the pressures to be a certain way and to have a certain career, to have a certain partner, to have a certain income, all these things, like all of those pressures that are placed on people might just be seen as like, oh, that's just how my parents are. They're just very strict, and this is how they perceive this is how they perceive life should be. But unfortunately, in doing all of this without having the freedom to really understand who a person is within themselves, the lack of opportunity to self-reflect, to understand like, oh, I really connect with art. I really connect with singing, with visual art, with writing, with this career, or I want to explore other countries. I want to explore like learning how to do calligraphy, whatever it might be, right? Like just these intrinsic desires we have to connect. It's like those, like what I call like small, big things, right? They might appear to be small, but they're such defining things about a person to say like, oh, I'm a writer. Now, if that's not nurtured when a person is young and there are all these prescribed ways of living, that's very dissonant to what the person wants out of their life, but they're living for somebody else. They're living through a trauma-based environment. And so they don't get to explore these things. They don't get to explore the fact that there's this external force outside of them that is blocking their ability to get to know themselves better, to giving them the emotional space and the freedom to say, honey, what do you like? Like, what would you like to do today? Or like, what do you find to be fun? It's like, no, like that's not my parents. They did the best that they could, most definitely. But I was like, oh, I want to play tennis in school. And they're like, no, you don't play tennis. That's a waste. You have to use that time to study. Or I was like, oh, I want to write. I want to take this, like, I want to go to this writing thing after. They're like, writing is for the philosophers. Like, you don't need that. You're going to be a doctor. You have to study math and science, and that's it. And it's like, it seems like a small thing. Like, okay, they want me to be a certain career, and many parents are that way. However, it's like when a child doesn't get to explore the things that they just intrinsically love, and they're telling their parent this, and their parent is like, ah, that's crazy. You can't do that. It's like that child is starting to shut parts of themselves down. That child is not hearing their own voice any longer. And it becomes convoluted. Like, what do I want to do? Like, what is my voice versus the voice of other people who are putting on tremendous pressure for me to do all of these things? So then by the time people come to see me, they're telling me about a scenario in which they made a decision. And I'm like, do you think that decision was based on what you wanted or what your mother wanted or your father or your grandparent or your uncles, your aunties, the church, the mosque, the whatever, right? Like, and they're like, oh, I never thought about it that way. I thought it was something I didn't want, but I really would like to do this other thing. And pulling that apart, like those voices almost become one. Because a child, even an adult child, is still trying to please their parents, is still trying to figure out whether like what their parents want is the ultimate right thing. Like, and some parents can really get into a child's mind and say like, oh, you're only going to succeed if you are this particular career, making this amount of money and have these many kids and a husband or a wife that like does this type of job, and you're living in this state, in this town, and you're part of this community, and like everything is so prescribed. And so like, where does that child, whether they're a child or an adult child, where do they have the space to search for identity, for what intrinsically feels right and good and brings them joy and brings them peace, right? So that is the conundrum with trauma.
And this is such an important topic as well. I think that we can go on and on about this, like we can explore this in many levels. But for our discussion today, I think we have used up most part of our time today. And this is something I would love to revisit and talk in length with you. And I just would like to take this opportunity to tell our viewers who are joining for this discussion that if you could share your thoughts, your queries, and let us know, then it would give us some opportunity to come back with a future episode. So I would definitely love to explore that because it doesn't conclude the discussion. It gives us that avenue that there are more things to explore.
Right.
But we have talked about so many important things in our discussion today, but you are also a writer and you have published. And I wanted to hear about your books. And if we could tell our listeners where they can find them, we will put the links in our episode description so that they can. So, would you like to tell us about your books, please?
Sure. Yes, I have one book that is a book of essays that talks about the kaleidoscope of identities that we experience as immigrants. I talk about womanhood from my personal experiences, and then I also talk about just the experience of immigrants just doing everyday life and like are living side by side with people of other cultures and like what that experience is. So that you can find on www.pjtemple.com. And then I have a memoir that is currently under representation by Sarah Jane Freeman Literary Agency. And so hopefully that'll be coming out in the next few months. And then I also created a journal for Calm called Breathe and Release that's on the website as well. But so I'll just talk about trauma and patients are like, okay, so what do I do? And I'm like, so I talk a lot about in treatment about mind and body work and how our bodies hold trauma, even if our minds are not sure of what's happening and don't even sometimes remember our trauma because our mind to protect us tries to suppress or even cause us to repress and forget some of those things. And so I created a journal called Breathe and Release. That is a 1-year journal where each month the writer is focusing on one particular aspect of mind body work in order to decrease anxiety and to start developing a lifestyle of calm, which is very possible. I tell people it is very possible to understand and address anxiety but it's only done effectively through engaging both the mind and body. So that's what that journal does is it's a guided journal to learn principles like breath work, self-compassion, observation, just this sense of radical acceptance of like where we are in the moment. So a lot of mindfulness as well. So yeah, that's where I live, pjtemple.com.
That's amazing. And we will love to know more about that. I think this was more of an introduction, and we touched upon some of the areas that we wanted to. But again, this is such a complex subject. I would love to have you back on the discussion. And again, so for our viewers, feel free to share your questions either in this episode or to Patty or to me in social media or in threads, and it'll give us some more direction as to what we should explore in a future discussion. Thank you once again, Patty, for joining us, sharing such beautiful thoughts with the listeners today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for just, yeah, like I said, the discourse that we've had. It's very, what I'll say it again, what I really appreciated about your sharing was I was so honest, it was so raw, and we need to hear people's stories so that we know that we're not alone. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed being on. And yes, we did a I don't know, thinking about wine flights, I guess we did like a flight of various topics related to this, which was wonderful. But yes, I'd be happy to continue the conversation with you.